Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with particular focus on Vancouver. If you can sort of value out of these videos, all I ask you a thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. I want to thank all of you who have been following this channel since we started it in 2016. We just hit a cumulative 4 million views here on YouTube. So really appreciate that. I think we're just getting going. We're building a really great community here as we continue to try to educate and help people navigate these markets. Particularly when we circle back to the big piece of news this week was the CPI inflation numbers. So Canada's inflation coming in at 8.1% year over year, the highest rate of inflation in over 40 years. But again, it actually missed expectations. So the market was expecting inflation at 8.4. So I think that is like the one sort of thing to pinpoint or to sort of highlight here. And of course, when I did that on Twitter, everybody started freaking out saying, oh, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, inflation's going to double digits, it's never going to turn around. And just when I look at those comments and the replies to when you even suggest that maybe we're getting close to putting a top in inflation, maybe inflation will begin to roll over, that the comments and the hate that come from that is a really good sentiment indicator. Because I find that when everybody's on one side of the boat, everybody's got the same trade, which is that inflation trade, that it's here to stay indefinitely at persistently high levels. To me, again, is a sentiment trade, and I think that we are actually nearing that peak in inflation. Now, again, it can roll over and go from 8.1 to 7.5 to 6 to 5, and the central banks can be stuck with a recession and inflation at 5%, and then you're in that very challenging predicament. But I have no question that inflation, at least from a rate of change perspective, is going to roll over. I mean, the comps just get that much more difficult to beat. So I think that we're going to be entering that territory. And that's certainly what the commodity markets are telling us. It's certainly what the rates markets are telling us. In fact, if you look at what's happening in Canada's most important metric, I'd argue, is that Canada 5-year mortgage bond, it's back down to about 2.9%. Which is basically the market saying, hey, listen, inflation's probably close to peaking, it's going to peak, and we're going to enter a recession here. And so you've got bond yields actually falling down on the expectation of lower growth ahead. So that Canada 5-year bond has actually been declining, and you've actually seen some lenders in Canada, on the insured side, there was a lender that dropped rates by 40 basis points. So you're starting to see, looks to me, maybe it's a little bit early, but it certainly looks, if you look at rate activity over the last 4 to 5 weeks, it looks like we've probably put in a top in the Canada 5-year fixed mortgage rates. But again, even at these levels at 5%, you'd have to come back down to 4.8, 4.7, 4.5%. It's still too high for the market to digest at these prices. And again, if I point to, there's a great article here actually that was put up by Rate Hub, kind of quantifying the change since March, the change in interest rates versus the change in prices. So we've seen a decline in national home prices. In fact, if you look at national home prices on a quarterly basis, this was the single largest decline for average house prices in Canada going back to data since 1990. So this is a major shakeout that has happened in a very short time frame here for Canadian house prices. But if you look at, again, the change in mortgage rates, so you've had the increase obviously in rates, you've had a slight decrease in prices. What does that do? What is the typical income that you'd have to now require in order to basically afford or qualify, more importantly, qualify for the typical home? So in Vancouver, that's up 16%. You didn't need an extra, since March of 2022, you need an extra $31,000 in your salary to basically qualify for a home, given where benchmark prices are in Vancouver. In Calgary, you need an 18% increase. That's $16,000 in excess income. In Toronto, you need an extra $15,000. It's a 7% increase, so not as bad there, but that's because Toronto home prices have dropped about $120,000 to sort of at least partially offset the higher cost of borrowing. And so these are kind of things that we'll be watching, obviously, moving forward. Is like I said, even if rates come back down to 4.5%, 4.3%, 4.2%, it's just too high at these prices, and so we're going to see that adjustment lower. And part of the reason for that is everybody seems to be ignoring. Is again, I was looking at, I believe it was the one of the rates analysts or the fixed income analysts at BMO, calling for the Bank of Canada's overnight interest rate policy to hit 6%. And I'm going, man, like, is everyone just sort of forgetting the pile of debt that we have here in Canada and what that would do to the economy? I mean, you blow up, like the housing market's already blowing up with the overnight rate in Canada at 2.5%. You take that thing to 6%, you won't have an economy left. You won't have a banking system left. And the last thing you'll be worrying about is inflation. If rates are at 6%, I mean, you'd be talking about a serious deflation as housing prices drop and the rest of the economy crumbles underneath it. So, I mean, I got to go back and point to, the chart here in Canada. You have the private debt, right? Private debt is the most important debt. I mean, the government can accumulate lots and lots of debt. They can basically roll it over. They can issue, they can issue more. They can issue bonds. Households, households can't issue bonds. Corporates, sure, but they're basically subject to the free market setting those rates. If you look at Canada's private debt to GDP, it's sitting at 235%. That's higher than the Japan in the 1990s when it hit 213%, and their property bubble imploded because the Imperial Palace is worth more than all of California. So we've suddenly forgot that Canada has this massive debt load that is going to struggle to be serviced. In fact, if you look at the most recent data, again, where we look at the Bank of Canada hitting overnight rates at 2.5%, it's going to take some time for that to ultimately filter through into households, as we're seeing now with all these variable rate mortgage increases. But if you look at Canada's household interest cost as a percentage of disposable income is expected to hit record highs of just over 10.5% in the months ahead. That's a doubling from where it was at 5%. Of course, we've talked about also the debt servicing ratio for households will hit a record high in Q1 of this year. I remember the last time household debt servicing ratios hit record highs was in 2018 when we were in a recession, cutting rates, and house prices were declining. So this goes to show you how rate sensitive these markets are. But that's really all part of the Bank of Canada's plan. Again, I've talked about this before, but there's a recent interview here from Tiff Macklem, which we'll clip in, which again highlights that their goal is to bring these rate hikes forward, to accelerate the pace of rate hikes in the near term in order to basically slow the economy, essentially tip it into recession without saying you're in a recession, in order to slow growth and demand, and that is ultimately going to be very, very painful. So let's clip into Tiff Macklem's comments here in a recent CTV News interview.
Okay, but you just raised key interest rates a startling 100 basis points to 2.5% over a week ago, and you're warning more raises will come. So are we heading into a recession?
We're not projecting a recession. We are projecting that growth is going to slow materially, quite a bit. We're forecasting 3.5% growth for this year, 1.75% for next year. That's a pretty marked slowing. People are going to feel that. There will be some pain. But we do think 1.3%, 1.75%, that is positive growth. What we're trying to do is, the economy is in excess demand. It's overheated. So we do think there's a path to soft landing, but I will be very frank. That path is narrowing. With inflation at 8.1%, with inflation broadening, with inflation persisting, that path is narrowing. And really that gets back to why we front-loaded our decision.
So this is where we've got to, right? We've got that slowing economy, which everybody knows is coming. Everybody's looking at housing. The rates markets are figuring out. That's why you've got that 5-year bond yield falling down. You've got the Bank of Canada, which will do another rate hike here in September, which again is going to impact the rest of the economy, is going to impact the variable rate mortgages, which now account of all mortgage debt that is outstanding. 32% of that debt outstanding is in the form of variable rate mortgages. We've talked about it in last week's video that a lot of these mortgages, in fact, 80% of them have fixed payment structures, and a lot of them will ultimately get triggered when the Bank of Canada raises rates by, I would guess, a minimum 50 basis points in September. So there's a lot more hurt to come, and ultimately it's just a matter of time until the Bank of Canada will be prompted to pivot, I think, despite where inflation is. But again, I think I've talked about it before. As someone that was in the inflation bull camp for the last 18 plus months, I was early on the inflation camp.
We think there will be a need for considerable monetary policy support to generate a complete recovery. And in that low for long world, there are risks that housing could get carried away. So that is something we will be looking at very carefully, and we certainly will be updating through our financial hub, our monetary policy report, our financial system review.
This guy says we're starting to see signs of irrational or excessive exuberance. Again, I'm not sure which rear view window this guy is looking at, but he's 2 steps behind the market. And these central bankers are always 2 steps behind the market. If we look at what's happening in the national housing market, you right now have the home price index on a year-over-year basis. It's accelerating, showing a 12% year-over-year pace of growth. The highest that we've ever recorded is a 19% year-over-year growth in the early parts of 2017. I can almost guarantee you, because it's baked in the cake in the way that home price index model works, is that you will probably see home price growth accelerate above 19% probably by this summer. Regardless of what happens in the market, even if the market starts to stabilize and flatline from here, because of the way that home price index works on a lag, you'll probably still see that home price index accelerate probably towards new record high pace of growth. So you essentially have national home prices basically running at a 20% clip. And this guy says, well, we're starting to see some signs of excessive exuberance. But this is always the playbook. And the only thing that's going to stop this guy, remember, the Bank of Canada has already pledged no rate hikes until 2023, until the recovery is well underway. The only thing that is going to prevent or slow the housing market here is a pop of inflation and in inflation expectation. I actually had people commenting on this video telling me, you need to go watch Jeff Snyder, you're an idiot, there's deflation all around us, and stuck to the guns. And I'm telling you now, I think that the inflation story is going to roll over. I think of a structural term, or the medium term, we'll probably have structurally higher inflation. Maybe it continues to hover around 3.5% for the next 5 years. But to suggest it's going to stay here at 8% is pretty naive. And so we are going to roll over as the housing market rolls over, because it's such an important component of the economy, whether you like that or not. The math is just the math, which is 3% of Canadian GDP is strictly a function of resale housing market activity, which means that puts that on par with machinery and equipment and research and development on expenditures across all industries. Kudos for the stats. Thank you, my friend Ben Rebido. But if that kind of helps you frame up where I think things are right now, where they're going over the next 6 months, I certainly won't get every call right. Nobody's going to get 100% of the calls right. In fact, if you were, you'd probably be the richest man in the world if you never had a single call go wrong. It's really just hitting the probabilities of those calls. I mean, I think the top, money managers in the world, a guy like Stan Druckenmiller is hoping to hit, 55 or 60% of his bets. It's just a matter of when he hits those bets, he wants to hit them hard. So that's kind of how I look at it, because people love to sort of pile on. And again, these are incredibly difficult markets to sort of predict and figure out where they're going to go. So take everything I say with a caveat, but I think that the writing is on the wall for, I think, central bank policy, the amount of debt, at the end of the day, it is just math. If you run debt to GDP figures, something will have to break, and it's already breaking. We can see that in the housing market statistics. Nothing has changed. We'll get some sour numbers here in July, which I believe we should be close to reporting on in next week's video. So hope that helped. See you next week.